"If you drink that, Mr. Whitmore, you may not reach the shore." The words were quiet enough to be mistaken for a prayer, but every person on the upper deck heard them. Ethan Whitmore stood beneath a ceiling of golden lights on the main deck of the Meridian Star, the 220-foot yacht that carried his name across magazines, boardrooms, and whispered conversations from Miami to Newport. The Atlantic rolled black and smooth around them. Champagne glittered in tall glasses. A jazz trio played near the stern. Investors smiled with the careful warmth of people who had already calculated what every handshake was worth. Ethan had one hand raised, his crystal glass inches from his mouth, his ivory blazer perfectly cut across broad shoulders, his silver hair combed back from a face that rarely showed surprise. Then the waitress stepped into the light. Clara Bennett wore the simple uniform assigned to every temporary server on the yacht. White blouse, black apron, polished shoes meant for standing through 12-hour shifts. The only color on her was a wine-red ribbon tying back her brown hair. She was 29, pale from too many indoor shifts, with calm blue eyes that looked older than her face. She did not rush. She did not grab the glass. She only placed her silver tray on the table beside him and looked at the drink as if it had spoken first. The music thinned. Someone laughed once, softly, then stopped when Ethan did not smile. Victor Hale, the guest of honor and the man Ethan was supposed to sign with before midnight, lifted his brows in theatrical amusement. "Is this part of the entertainment?" he asked. A few guests relaxed at the sound of his voice. Victor had that effect. He could make discomfort feel like a joke if it helped him keep control of a room. Ethan did not look away from Clara. He had built a shipping empire by refusing interruptions. He did not tolerate weak numbers, late reports, emotional speeches, or employees who mistook proximity for importance. On his yacht, during his celebration, in front of $50 million worth of investors, a waitress had just told him not to drink. "Miss," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "you have exactly 5 seconds to explain yourself." Clara heard the warning beneath the politeness. She also heard the small shift behind her, the nervous breath from the bartender, the faint click of a phone being locked too quickly, the ocean tapping against the hull like knuckles on a door. All evening, people had spoken around her as if she were furniture. They had ordered, complained, whispered, laughed, and confessed small truths into the air because servers were never expected to carry meaning, only plates. But Clara had listened. She had heard Victor's assistant say, "Only his glass." She had heard the bartender answer, "Before the toast." She had heard the tiny sound of glass against marble in the service pantry when no bottle should have been open. And now she saw the smallest ring of cloudy residue near the rim of Ethan Whitmore's champagne flute, almost invisible beneath the deck lights. Her fingers tightened once against the edge of the tray. Her voice stayed level. "I tried to tell your manager. I tried to tell security. No one listened." Ethan's jaw hardened. Behind him, cameras waited for the toast, investors waited for confidence, and Victor waited with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Clara looked at the millionaire who owned the yacht, the party, the contracts, and almost every voice on board. Then she said the one thing no one there expected from a woman in an apron. "So now I'm asking you to listen before it costs you more than money." Ethan did not lower the glass at first. Pride held his hand in the air longer than reason should have allowed. Around him, the deck had become so quiet that the soft slap of water against the yacht sounded almost deliberate. Clara felt every pair of eyes on her uniform, on her wine-red ribbon, on the plain black apron that suddenly seemed to offend the room more than the accusation itself. Victor Hale gave a polished laugh and stepped closer, careful not to seem too eager. "Ethan, you cannot seriously be entertaining this." She probably overheard half a sentence and invented the rest. Ethan's eyes moved to him, then back to Clara. That hesitation was small, barely a second, but Clara saw it. She had spent years noticing the moments powerful people tried to hide. "What exactly do you think is wrong with my drink?" Ethan asked. Clara looked at the flute, then at the white linen napkin folded beside the caviar tray. "I do not think," she said. "I observed." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The word landed harder than panic would have. She reached for the napkin, but one of Ethan's security men moved as if to stop her. Ethan lifted 2 fingers. The guard froze. Clara took the napkin and gently touched it to the rim of the glass. She did not spill the champagne. She did not make a scene. She only pressed once, then held the linen under the deck light. At first, there was nothing, just white fabric under gold. Then a faint gray smear appeared, thin as smoke. Ethan's expression changed. Not fear. Not yet. Recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when a man who trusts systems realizes a system has failed him. Victor's smile thinned. Residue from the polish. These glasses were cleaned in a hurry. Clara turned the napkin slightly, letting the light catch the mark. Then every glass should have it. She looked toward the table where other flutes waited untouched. They do not. Ethan set his glass down very slowly. The small sound of crystal meeting would travel across the deck. "Bring me another napkin," he said. His voice no longer belonged to the host of a party. It belonged to the man who had built companies by following patterns other people missed. A steward hurried forward. Clara tested 3 nearby glasses the same way. Clean, clean, clean. Then she tested the flute Victor had handed Ethan 5 minutes earlier. The gray mark deepened. Someone gasped. Victor's assistant, a narrow man with restless hands, took 1 step toward the service corridor. Clara saw it before security did. "That man knows where the bottle came from," she said without raising her voice. The assistant stopped. Ethan looked at him. For the first time that night, everyone listened. The bartender near the sliding doors swallowed hard, his face losing color under the warm lights. Ethan turned to his head of security. "Lock down the service exits. Quietly. No alarms. No spectacle." The command was calm, but the air changed around it. Guests were guided away from the table with practiced smiles. The jazz trio did not resume. Victor spread his hands, still trying to look amused, but the room had left him behind. Clara stood beside the table, holding the stained napkin between 2 fingers. Her hand was steady now. Ethan noticed that, too. It bothered him more than the residue. She was not enjoying this. She was not trying to be important. She looked like someone who had already paid a price for being ignored. "How did you hear them?" he asked. Clara's eyes flicked toward the pantry door, then the bartender, then the ocean beyond the rail. "Because people talk freely around uniforms," she said. "They think service means silence." Ethan had no answer. The words touched something old and unwelcome in him. A memory of his former wife standing in the doorway of their Boston townhouse, suitcase beside her, saying, "You hear words, Ethan. You do not listen." He had dismissed that sentence for 3 years as emotional exaggeration. Now it stood on his deck wearing a waitress uniform, holding proof on a white napkin. Clara placed the linen on the table between them. "I am not asking you to trust me," she said. "I am asking you to check what everyone else ignored." The stained napkin stayed on the table like a small white flag no one wanted to claim. Ethan watched his security team move through the deck with quiet efficiency, closing service doors, speaking into earpieces, guiding guests away from the champagne station without explaining too much. That was how wealthy rooms protected themselves. They softened danger until it looked like inconvenience. Clara had seen it before. A broken railing became a maintenance issue. A missing radio call became a misunderstanding. A warning became nervousness, until the water proved otherwise. Victor Hale stood near the rail with his hands in his pockets, the moonlight cutting his face into calm angles. He had recovered quickly. Men like him always did. "Ethan," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound private while still allowing important people to hear. "This is becoming embarrassing. We are about to delay a 9-figure agreement because a temporary server found a mark on a glass." Clara did not look at him. She looked at the bartender. He was trying not to look at the pantry. His shoulders were too stiff. His hands hung empty, but his right thumb kept rubbing the side of his index finger, over and over, as if wiping away something that was no longer there. Ethan noticed Clara noticing. "Bring the bottle," he said. The bartender blinked. "Sir, the bottle used for my toast." The bartender turned toward the bar, but Clara spoke first. "Not that one." The word stopped him halfway. She pointed toward the service pantry. "The open bottle is not on the bar anymore. It is behind the second ice bin, under a towel." The bartender stared at her, and in that single unguarded second, the truth entered the room before the evidence did. Ethan's head of security stepped inside the pantry. The guests waited. The ocean pressed softly against the yacht. A minute passed. Then the guard returned holding a champagne bottle wrapped in a white towel, its foil torn unevenly near the neck. Ethan looked at Victor. Victor smiled as if this were still beneath him. Anyone could have put that there. Clara nodded once. Yes, she said. That is why you should check the towel. The guard unfolded it carefully on the table. Near one corner was a faint stain, the same gray cast as the napkin. Beside it, almost hidden in the folds, was a small torn label from the service card inventory. Clara leaned in, reading the numbers. Cart 3, she said. That cart was assigned to the forward lounge until 8:40. At 8:45, Mr. Hale's assistant asked me where the private pantry was because he said he needed sparkling water without lime. The assistant's face changed. It was not dramatic. No collapse. No confession. Just the tiny failure of a man who had believed no one would remember a simple question asked of a waitress. Ethan turned to him. Is that true? The assistant opened his mouth, then closed it. Victor's voice sharpened. Do not answer anything without counsel. That was the wrong sentence. Everyone heard it. Ethan's eyes went still. Clara felt the temperature of the deck drop, though the night was warm. Counsel, Ethan repeated. Victor exhaled, annoyed now, the mask slipping at the edges. You are letting a woman who refills coffee direct a corporate investigation. Clara felt the insult pass through the air and fall harmlessly at her feet. She had carried heavier things than that. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, not as an employee, not as an interruption, but as a person standing in the narrow space between his pride and the truth. Miss Bennett, he said, using her name for the first time. What else did you hear? Clara's fingers brushed the wine-red ribbon at the back of her hair, a habit she had when deciding whether to step into a storm. I heard your engineer call twice about an unusual pressure reading near the lower deck, she said. I heard your event manager tell him not to bother you until after the toast. I heard your ex-wife leave a voice message asking you to call because your daughter was trying to reach you before boarding school lights out. And I heard you tell your assistant that nothing mattered tonight except the deal. Ethan's face tightened, but he did not interrupt. The yacht around them seemed suddenly too large, too bright, too full of people who had been speaking all evening while no one had been listening. Clara lowered her voice. The glass may not be the only warning you ignored tonight. For one breath, Ethan Whitmore looked like a man standing on the deck of someone else's life. The music had stopped. The champagne had been removed. Victor Hale was no longer smiling, and the assistant who had asked about sparkling water without lime stood beside security with his eyes fixed on the floor. But Clara's last sentence had opened a different door, one no guard could close. Ethan turned toward his chief engineer, a broad-shouldered woman named Dana Price, who had been waiting near the stairwell with a radio clipped to her belt and worry held tightly in her mouth. What pressure reading? Ethan asked. Dana glanced at the guests, then at Clara, then back at the man who signed her checks. Lower service line near the port stabilizers, sir. It is probably a sensor issue, but I called twice because the reading kept jumping. Ethan's assistant stepped forward quickly. Mr. Whitmore, I was going to brief you after the signing. The event schedule was extremely tight. Clara heard the old rhythm in that excuse. Later. After. Not now. Words people used when truth arrived at an inconvenient time. Ethan stared at his assistant as if seeing him from a distance. You decided what I needed to hear. The assistant swallowed. I was protecting the deal. Ethan gave a small, humorless breath. Everyone keeps protecting the deal. Victor adjusted his cuffs. Because the deal matters. This is business, Ethan. A yacht has sensors. Staff overreact. A waitress overhears fragments, and suddenly everyone forgets why we are here. This time, Clara looked at him. Not angrily. Almost sadly. Fragments become warnings when they all point the same way. Dana's radio crackled softly. She lifted it to her ear, listened, and her face changed. Sir, bridge crew says the port stabilizer alarm just came back. Still minor, but they recommend slowing speed until they inspect it. Ethan looked toward the dark water. The Meridian Star was still moving, not fast, but enough for the city lights behind them to look farther away than they should. A half hour earlier, he would have ordered the captain to maintain course. A schedule was a schedule. A celebration was a performance. Weakness was expensive. Now his eyes moved to Clara's stained napkin, then to the hidden bottle, then to the service corridor where overlooked people had been carrying the truth all night. Slow the yacht, he said. Dana nodded immediately into her radio. Victor's jaw tightened. You are delaying the signing because of a mechanical light. Ethan turned to him. No, I am delaying it because every warning tonight came from someone I was trained not to hear. The words surprised even him. They seemed to hang in the salt air, plain and heavy. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment, not in submission, but because she understood the cost of saying something true in public. Ethan's phone buzzed on the cocktail table. No one touched it. It buzzed again. The screen lit up with a missed call notification from his daughter, Lily. Then a message appeared beneath it. "Dad, are you still too busy?" Ethan looked at the words as if they were another stain under bright light. His hand moved, stopped, then picked up the phone. The deck watched him, but for once he did not perform for them. He stepped away from Victor, away from the contract, away from the cameras. He called his daughter back. Clara heard only his side of the conversation, and even that was barely more than a whisper. "I am here," he said. A pause. His shoulders softened. "No, I am listening now." The simple sentence did what all the money on the yacht could not do. It changed the room. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the faces of the crew near the stairwell, in Dana's quiet exhale, in the way the bartender finally stopped rubbing his thumb against his finger. Victor saw it too. He understood that control had shifted, not to Ethan, and not to himself, but to the truth Clara had carried across the deck on a silver tray. When Ethan ended the call, he returned to the table, but he did not reach for the contract. He reached for the radio beside Dana. "I want a full systems check," he said. "And I want every crew member who raised a concern tonight brought to me directly." Then he looked at Clara Bennett, the waitress with the wine-red ribbon and the steady eyes. Starting with her, the yacht slowed beneath their feet, and for the first time that night, the Meridian Star felt less like a floating palace and more like a vessel full of people who needed one another. The change was subtle. The vibration under the deck softened. The black water beside the rail no longer streamed past in long silver lines. Crew members began appearing from places guests never noticed. Stairwells, service doors, the narrow hallway behind the galley, the bridge access near the forward lounge. They came carefully, as if being called before Ethan Whitmore had always meant blame. Clara stood near the cocktail table with her hands folded in front of her apron, the wine-red ribbon at the back of her hair stirring in the wind. Ethan saw the way the crew looked at her first, then at him. That told him more than any report. They trusted the waitress before they trusted the owner. Dana Price brought a clipboard and a tablet loaded with maintenance alerts. 3 concerns were logged in the last 90 minutes, she said. 1 stabilizer pressure reading. 1 service pantry access issue. 1 complaint from a deckhand who saw Mr. Hale's assistant near a restricted cabinet. The deckhand, a young man named Caleb, stepped forward. His face was pale under the yacht lights. "I tried to tell Mr. Rawlings," he said, nodding toward Ethan's assistant. "But he said the signing mattered more than a misplaced guest." Ethan's assistant looked down. Victor gave a low scoff. "This is becoming a theater of hurt feelings." Clara turned slightly. "No," she said. "It is becoming a record." The simplicity of it quieted him. Ethan looked at Clara again, and something in his expression had changed from suspicion to study. "How did you know which warnings belonged together?" he asked. Clara did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted past him to the dark line where the ocean met the sky. "My father worked boats out of Gloucester," she said. "Not yachts. Fishing boats. Repair boats. Anything that paid enough to keep heat in the house." Her voice remained even, but the air around the words grew heavier. "When I was 17, he was hired for a private charter. He heard a sound in the engine room that did not match the gauges. He reported it 3 times. Dana's face softened. Several crew members lowered their eyes. Clara kept looking at the water. The owner told him not to ruin the evening. The captain waited. The guests danced. By the time they listened, the damage had already cost the boat, the company, and families more than anyone wanted to admit. She touched the edge of her tray with one finger, grounding herself. "My father came home, but he was never the same after that. He used to say the ocean does not punish arrogance. It simply refuses to negotiate with it." No one spoke. Even Victor had no immediate answer. Ethan felt the sentence move through him with the slow force of tide water. He thought of every memo he had skimmed, every employee he had interrupted, every call he had sent to voicemail because it arrived during something more important. He thought of Lily asking if he was still too busy. He thought of his former wife and how tired she had looked the last time she stopped trying to be heard. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "why are you working as a server if you know maritime systems that well?" Clara gave the smallest smile, not bitter, not proud. Because knowing things does not always open doors. Sometimes it only teaches you where the doors are locked. Ethan had no defense against that. The security chief returned with footage from the pantry camera. On the tablet screen, Victor's assistant entered the restricted area at 8:46, carrying a folded towel. The bartender followed 2 minutes later. At 8:51, the open bottle disappeared under the ice bin. The footage was clear enough, quiet enough, final enough. Victor's face hardened, but his power had begun to drain from the room. Ethan looked at the contract waiting beside the untouched champagne. A few hours earlier, it had seemed like the point of the night. Now it looked like paper that had almost taught him nothing. He closed the folder without signing. "Mr. Hale," he said, "this agreement is over." Victor's eyes flashed. "You are making a mistake." Ethan looked toward Clara, then at the crew gathered behind her, then back at the man who had counted on being believed over everyone smaller than himself. "No," Ethan said. "For once, I am listening before I make one." Victor Hale did not argue after that. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because the room had changed its ears. The same guests who had smiled at his polished jokes now watched the tablet footage in silence. The same executives who had leaned toward money now leaned toward proof. Security escorted Victor and his assistant to a private lounge until the Coast Guard could meet the yacht at harbor, and no one clapped, no one cheered, no one turned the moment into entertainment. It was too close to shame for that. Ethan stood by the table after they were gone, one hand resting near the unsigned contract, the other near the champagne flute he had almost trusted more than a human warning. The gray mark on the napkin looked smaller now, almost harmless, and that made it worse. Some dangers did not arrive loudly. Some came dressed as convenience, as confidence, as a smile from a man everyone assumed belonged in the room. Clara stepped back toward the service corridor, ready to disappear the way servers always disappeared once the crisis passed. Ethan noticed. "Miss Bennett," he said. She stopped, but did not turn right away. The wind moved the wine-red ribbon against her neck. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore." He looked at the crew gathered near the stairwell, at Dana Price holding the maintenance tablet, at Caleb the deckhand who still looked stunned that his warning had mattered. Then he looked at Clara. "Please stay." It was not an order. That was what made her turn. Ethan removed his Swiss watch and placed it on the table beside the closed contract, not as a gift, but as if setting down a symbol he no longer wished to hide behind. "I owe everyone here an apology," he said. His voice carried across the deck without needing to rise. "I built a company by believing I was the best listener in every room. Tonight, I learned I was only listening to the loudest people." The crew did not respond at first. They were not used to public apologies from men in ivory blazers. Ethan faced Dana. "You called twice. I ignored the system that allowed your warning to be delayed." He looked at Caleb. "You reported what you saw. You were dismissed." Then he looked at Clara, and the pause before her name felt different from all the pauses before it. "And you tried to save my life, my crew, and this vessel before I gave you permission to speak." Clara held his gaze. "Permission was never the point," she said softly. Ethan nodded, accepting the correction like a man learning a language he should have known years ago. The Meridian Star reached harbor just as the first pale line of dawn touched the water. The city appeared slowly, steel and glass waking under a pink sky. Guests left quietly. Some avoided Clara's eyes. Others thanked her with awkward sincerity, as if gratitude felt heavier when it came late. Ethan stayed on the deck until the last investigator stepped aboard. He did not offer Clara a dramatic reward in front of cameras. He did not turn her pain into a headline. Instead, he pulled out a chair at the main conference table where only investors had been allowed earlier that night. "I want your statement first," he said. Clara looked at the chair, then at the crew waiting behind her. "Start with them," she said. "They always know before the owners do." Ethan looked toward Dana, Caleb, the stewards, the bartender who had already begun telling the truth, and the quiet workers who had kept his floating palace alive while being treated like shadows. Slowly, he stepped away from the head of the table. Clara sat only after the crew did. Morning filled the windows. The cold coffee from the night before still rested on the side table, untouched, dark, honest. Ethan saw it and finally understood. The yacht had carried his name. The contracts had carried his signature. The party had carried his power. But the truth had been carried by the woman no one thought to hear. And sometimes, The quiet ones are not silent because they have nothing to say. They are silent because they are listening to everything. By 7:30 in the morning, the Meridian Star no longer looked like a place where powerful people had nearly mistaken silence for safety. The party flowers had begun to wilt in their crystal vases. Half-empty glasses had been cleared from the deck. The jazz instruments were packed away in black cases near the stern. Sunlight moved across the polished floorboards in clean, quiet strips, revealing every mark the night had tried to hide. Inside the main conference room, the long table that had been prepared for a 9-figure signing now held coffee, water, crew statements, maintenance logs, and a stack of printed security stills. Ethan Whitmore sat near the middle, not at the head. It was the first thing everyone noticed and the last thing anyone commented on. Dana Price spoke first, laying out the stabilizer issue in plain language, without softening the details to protect anyone's ego. Caleb followed, his voice shaking at first, then steadier when Ethan did not interrupt him. Two stewards described the assistant's movement through the pantry. A junior event planner admitted she had been told to keep complaints away from Ethan until after the toast. Each statement was small on its own. Together, they formed a map of a culture Ethan had built without ever naming it. Clara listened from the far side of the table, hands resting around a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold again. She did not act triumphant. She did not lean back as if she had won. She looked tired in the way people look tired after being believed too late. Ethan noticed the shadows under her blue eyes, the small crease in her white blouse, the wine-red ribbon now loosened from the long night. "Miss Bennett," one of the investigators asked, "why did you continue watching the glass after your warning was dismissed?" Clara glanced at Ethan, then back to the investigator. "Because dismissal does not change danger," she said. The room grew still around that sentence. Ethan wrote it down, though he knew he would not forget it. Near the windows, his assistant, Rawlings, stood with his hands clasped in front of him. He had not been involved in Victor's plan, the first review suggested, but he had done what polished assistants often did in polished worlds. He had filtered discomfort. He had buried inconvenience. He had protected access until access became a wall. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was careful. "I believed I was preserving the evening." Clara looked at him, not unkindly. "You were preserving the appearance of the evening." Rawlings lowered his eyes. Ethan did not rescue him from the truth. That restraint felt unfamiliar in his own body. For years, he had confused loyalty with insulation. He had paid people to keep friction away, then wondered why the people closest to problems sounded so far away. At 9:15, his phone buzzed again. This time, he answered before the second vibration. "Good morning, Lily," he said, stepping just outside the conference room, but leaving the glass door open. Clara did not mean to listen, but his voice carried softly. "No, sweetheart, I am not too busy." A pause. The sea shifted against the hull. "Yes, I would like to hear about the science fair." No deal that morning mattered more than the way his shoulders eased when his daughter started talking. Clara looked down at her coffee, and for the first time since the night began, her face softened. Not because Ethan had become a different man in one sunrise. People did not change that cleanly. But a door had opened. A real one. When Ethan returned, he did not apologize for taking the call. He simply sat down and listened to the next crew member. By noon, the investigators had enough to begin their formal report. Victor Hale's agreement was suspended indefinitely. The yacht's internal procedures were frozen for review. Every crew member who had filed a concern would be interviewed again, this time without managers editing their words first. Ethan signed the order himself, then slid the page across the table for Dana to witness. "No warning gets buried because it is inconvenient," he said. Dana nodded, but Clara watched his hand more than his face. It no longer hovered over the paper like a man claiming ownership. It rested there like a man accepting responsibility. When the room began to empty, Ethan turned to Clara. "You said knowing things does not always open doors." She stood, smoothing her apron out of habit. "That has been my experience." Ethan looked toward the crew still gathered in the hall. "Then we will start with the locked ones." Clara did not smile right away. She studied him for a long second, measuring not the promise, but the weight behind it. "Start by listening when opening them costs you something," she said. Ethan nodded. Outside the windows, the harbor water flashed bright under the noon sun, and the Meridian Star sat still at last, no longer rushing toward a deal, a toast, or a mistake. For the first time since Clara had stepped onto that yacht, the quiet did not feel like being ignored. It felt like space being made for the truth to speak. By late afternoon, the harbor had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Ferries pushed white trails across the water. Gulls circled above the marina. Dock workers shouted over the low hum of engines, and the Meridian Star sat among smaller boats like a mansion that had learned, too late, that size did not make it wiser. Clara Bennett stepped off the gangway with her black apron folded over one arm and her worn canvas bag against her shoulder. The wine-red ribbon still held her hair back, though several brown strands had loosened around her face. She expected to leave quietly. That was how most service shifts ended. You cleaned what others left behind, signed out, and became invisible again before anyone had to remember your name. But Dana Price was waiting near the dock office with Caleb and 3 stewards. No speeches, no grand gestures, just people standing there because she had stood for them first. Caleb held out a paper cup from the coffee stand across the street. "It is fresh," he said. "Not yacht coffee." Clara took it with both hands, and the warmth surprised her. "Thank you." Dana leaned against the railing, arms crossed, eyes on the water. "Ethan scheduled crew listening sessions for every vessel in the company," she said. "Not public relations. Paid time. Direct reports. No managers filtering anything." Clara looked toward the yacht. Through the upper windows, she could see Ethan inside the conference room, still in his ivory blazer, sleeves slightly creased, speaking with investigators instead of investors. "That is a start," she said. Dana nodded. "That is what I told him." Across the dock, Ethan looked up and saw Clara through the glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he excused himself from the room and came down the gangway alone. No assistant, no security wall, no cameras arranged to catch humility at a flattering angle. He stopped several feet away from her, leaving enough space for the conversation to belong to both of them. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I spoke with the Maritime Training Board." Clara's expression did not change, but her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "Why?" "Because Dana told me your father was one of the best small vessel mechanics in Massachusetts before that charter ended his career. And because you saw connections last night that my entire page structure missed." Clara looked at him carefully. "Mr. Whitmore, I do not need charity." "I know." He said it quickly, then slowed himself down. Listening, he had learned, also meant not rushing to sound generous. "This is not charity. It is an offer to help build a safety review program led by crew experience, not executive comfort. You would be paid as a consultant. You would report findings directly to the board. You would have authority to stop an event, delay a departure, or escalate a warning when something does not feel right." The wind moved between them. Clara heard rigging clink against a mast nearby, a child laughing on a passing sailboat. Ethan's breath held, as if he was trying not to turn the offer into pressure. "And if my findings embarrass you?" she asked. Ethan looked back at the Meridian Star. The name gleamed in chrome along the hull. "Then they will finally be useful." Clara studied his face. The old arrogance was not gone. It had roots too deep for one night to pull out. But something had cracked through it. Not performance. Not guilt alone. A willingness to be corrected. That was rarer than apology. She thought of her father at their kitchen table in Gloucester, tapping one finger against a mug while saying, "Boats talk before they break. Clara, people do too. Learn the difference between noise and warning." For years, she had carried that sentence into diners, banquet halls, ferries, and private yachts, listening while being overlooked. Now the overlooking had stopped, at least here, at least for this moment. She looked at Dana, then Caleb, then the stewards waiting without pretending not to wait. "I will consider it," she said. Ethan nodded once. "That is fair." Clara almost smiled. "No, Mr. Whitmore. That is listening." The smallest laugh moved through the group, soft and relieved. Ethan accepted it without trying to own it. As Clara walked down the dock, fresh coffee in her hands and evening light on the water, she did not feel rescued. She felt recognized. And there was a difference. Rescue made a person grateful. Recognition gave a person room to stand. 3 weeks later, Clara Bennett returned to the Meridian Star before sunrise, not through the service entrance, but through the main gangway with a visitor badge that read Safety Review Consultant. She paused when she saw it. The words looked almost too formal beside her simple navy coat and the same wine-red ribbon holding back her brown hair. The harbor was quiet, silver with morning fog, and the yacht lights glowed softly against the water. This time, no one asked her to carry a tray. Dana Price met her at the entrance with a tablet, a hard hat, and a smile that said more than welcome. "Ready to make rich people uncomfortable?" Dana asked. Clara took the hard hat. "Only if the truth requires it." Inside, the yacht had changed in ways most guests would never notice. Warning logs were posted in crew areas. Emergency reports went directly to the bridge and the safety board. Every department had a red phone line that could pause an event without asking a manager for permission. Small changes, practical changes, the kind that saved people before anyone needed a speech. Ethan Whitmore arrived 10 minutes later in an ivory blazer, but without the old wall of assistants surrounding him. He carried his own coffee. Clara noticed that first. He greeted Dana, then Caleb, then the steward who had once been afraid to speak above a whisper. When he reached Clara, he did not offer his hand immediately, as if he had finally learned not to assume access. "Miss Bennett," he said, "thank you for coming back." Clara looked past him to the main deck, where folding chairs had been arranged for the first listening session. Not investors, not executives, engineers, deckhands, stewards, cooks, cleaners, radio operators. The people who heard the ship breathe. "I said I would consider it," she replied. "I did not say I would make this easy." Ethan's mouth curved slightly. "I was hoping you would not." The session began at 7 o'clock. At first, the crew spoke carefully, choosing safe words, watching Ethan's face for signs of regret. Clara noticed and let the silence sit. She had learned that people filled silence only when they believed it would not be used against them. Finally, an older cook named Maria raised her hand and said the galley exhaust alarms had been malfunctioning for 2 months. Then a radio operator mentioned that guest schedules often overrode weather recommendations. Caleb described how young crew members were told to stay invisible around important clients. One by one, the hidden map appeared. Ethan listened. Not perfectly. Twice, he started to explain. Twice, Clara looked at him, and he stopped. By noon, the whiteboard behind them was covered with problems money had failed to see because pride had taught people to whisper. Ethan stood at the end, reading every line. "We fix all of it," he said. "Not the easiest parts. All of it." No one applauded. That made Clara trust the moment more. Real change did not always sound like cheering. Sometimes it sounded like tired people exhaling because they had finally been heard. Later, on the upper deck, Ethan found Clara standing near the rail, watching gulls cut through the fog. "My daughter asked about you," he said. Clara glanced at him. "Lily." He nodded. "She said anyone who can make me listen must be very powerful." Clara smiled then, small and genuine. "Smart girl." Ethan looked out at the water. "She gets that from her mother." The admission was quiet, unpolished, and Clara let it remain that way. Below them, the crew moved across the deck with a different rhythm. Not fearless, not yet, but less invisible. Clara thought of her father, of his rough hands wrapped around a coffee mug, of the sentence he had left her like a compass. Boats talk before they break. People do too. That morning, for the first time in years, she felt as if someone had finally answered him. Ethan placed his untouched coffee on the rail between them. It had gone cold while he was listening downstairs. He noticed, then gave a short breath that was almost a laugh. "I suppose I still have work to do." Clara looked at the cup, then at the yacht, then at the people whose voices had begun to change it. "We all do," she said. The fog lifted slowly from the harbor, revealing the water one silver piece at a time. The Meridian Star still carried Ethan Whitmore's name. But now, beneath that name, there were voices moving through its halls, no longer treated as background noise. And Clara Bennett, once the waitress no one expected to hear, had become the reason they were heard at all.